Liberation Day, markets collapsing, and penguins. Yes, this is the top 5 financials for Trump this week, and today we discuss. Another week, another series of events regarding Donald Trump and how those affect the financial world and the world itself. And this week we have, of course, not only it's not going to be different, probably it's going to be even more impactful, the events of this week on the decisions of the President of the United States and the rest of the economy. So let's start. Number one, of course, we have Liberation Day on April 3rd, that we had this particular event, if you want to call it, like this, and it was the announcement of tariffs that the United States will impose to the rest of the world that are, quote unquote, in reciprocity against the tariffs that those particular countries charge to the US and US goods. And of course, we saw here Trump with very specific charts and, spreadsheets of each country and each territory because no one was safe. He even imposed tariffs on penguins. Yes, that's not a joke. It's not a rhetoric. He even slapped tariffs to a particular territory called Earl and McDonald. Apparently, is a territory from Australia that doesn't have even inhabitants, human inhabitants, only has penguins. And of course, the all social media, Twitter, X, as you want to call it, with a bunch of memes. Let's put a couple here regarding the Trump declaring trade war against penguins. Well, now going with the serious events, and he imposed very harsh tariffs against China, the European Union, Vietnam, Cambodia. That Cambodia got one of the highest. South Korea, Japan, and basically every country in the world. And the baseline was at 10% of tariffs to basically every country. Now, the particular exceptions on this chart of tariffs were Mexico and Canada, that they will have tariffs of their own, but still on negotiations over there. And also you have to include the USMCA agreement. And with countries like Russia and Iran, according to the White House, they were not announced tariffs against those countries on this particular chart because they already are suffering severe sanctions. So, according to the White House, still there's not a point in order to do that. We also have to talk about the tariffs imposed to vehicles, automobiles manufactured outside of the United States and then, brought back to the US market. And also, Trump this week hinted that semiconductors and pharmaceuticals will also be sanctioned. I mean, of course, made outside of the United States. Now, the funny thing regarding the tariffs and the calculation in order to reach such number is that at first it was announced that such tariffs will be retaliatory against the tariffs that those countries charge to the to US imports to such country. However, everyone figured out quickly that the calculation is actually a basic equation, that is the trade deficit that the United States has against that particular country, divided by the total exports that such country has to the United States. So basically, it's not retaliation against tariffs that U.S. exporters suffer on those countries, but is in order to punish the trade surplus that other countries have against the United States. That, I mean, is weird. And even the White House issued a statement saying that no, it's retaliatory. We had a complicated, let's say, scheme in order to reach to that particular number. But actually, it's just that same formula. The trade surplus of a particular country divided by the trade export. So, I mean, you cannot believe it. So basically, everyone is scratching their heads after this announcement because this is not retaliatory against tariffs, is retaliatory against trade surplus or deficits. Number two, we have to talk about China that strikes back this week. On Friday, China announced a 34% tariff against U.S. imports to China. And the situation is that, of course, China and the rest of the nations, especially the trading partners, are upset due to this particular decision, especially the ones that have a trade surplus against the US trade every single year. Now, the issue with China that has at this particular US imposed a 34% tariffs, and that is added to a 20% that Trump announced just a few weeks ago, and also could reach 79% if China decides to buy Venezuelan crude oil. And this, in case you don't know, just a couple of weeks ago, Trump announced secondary tariffs to Venezuela regarding their exports of oil and gas. So every country that purchases both oil and gas from Venezuela will suffer an additional 25% tariff. And the biggest markets impacted are, of course, China, but also India, Spain, and on a lesser degree, a handful of markets in Asia. But also remember that the United States is also a buyer, a regular buyer of Venezuelan crude oil, but apparently they stopped or they decided to stop. So we have to wait what is going to happen on that particular regard. But of course, the main point is that China is getting one of the highest tariffs imposed by this new Trump administration, and that is right now is 54% and could reach 79% if they decide to buy this particular kind of oil. Number three, we have the US global partners regarding commerce also responding to this, of course, this announcement. First, we have Canada, that of course, Canada has been excluded for now on this particular list of retaliatory tariffs, but they announced a 25% counter tariff of their own against US products. Also, the European Union that made an announcement of their own, the president of Europe, Ursula von der Leyen, but they right now are having discussions with the US Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, in order to, see what's going on and see how is actually going to affect, how it's going to be put in practice on real terms. Now, funny thing is that Israel, for instance, Israel gets a 17% tariffs for, of course, Israeli products, being one of the closest allies of the United States. So this goes against everyone. No one get exemptions. Now, another funny thing about the global partners is that Latin America, most of the Latin American economies got just the lowest tariffs imposed, that most of the countries got around 10%, so 10 and 10%, according to the announcement on April 3rd. But this there are a couple of issues with that. First, Latin America actually is more expensive for purchasing, on retail, the U.S. goods and services, mostly the goods, like Nike shoes or iPhones and things like that. So, I mean, the tariffs, I was thinking that it will be higher for Latin American countries like Brazil, Colombia, Argentina. Argentina is horrible for a market to import your goods. Argentina, in the past century, they had this particular protectionist economic policies, and that included higher tariffs for importing goods to Argentina in order to protect the national industry. And that hasn't worked out very well for the average Argentinian. However, Milei just visited Donald Trump this week, and apparently is on the works a free trade agreement that will be zero bound regarding reciprocity on tariffs, and that basically paves the way for the having a better trade relationship with the United States. Basically, that's what Trump is doing right now, is looking to negotiate with each country individually in order to have a more fair, trade agreement. And the other thing is regarding, of course, the tariffs. When we see that the closest, one of the patterns on this particular tariffs announcement is that the closer that you are geographically to the United States, specifically on the same hemisphere, so basically in the Americas, you get a lower tariffs. So that is hinting that nearshoring might be alive and well. And actually, that was my first reaction. Just like Marty McFly, and I'm sorry, I'm a big fan of Back to the Future. So the main point is, yes, we have to wait to see. So basically, globalization and the worldwide supply chains are gonna suffer a rearrangement, and right now we're gonna have consequences on the short term. Let's see what happens on the midterm and the long term. Number four, is now the best time to talk about a recession coming to the United States, something that we have discussed previously, the possibility or the probability of a recession. And according to several sources like JP Morgan, Moody's, the Tax Foundation, they are saying that right now the forecast that they have for the US GDP for this year went from slightly positive to neutral and slightly negative. Before, between these particular groups, they had a GDP growth from 1 to 1.5% of GDP per year, but now they have reduced their forecast, their expectations to zero and maybe a negative GDP for this year, aka recession. So, according to several analysts right now, the recession is likely, and the probabilities go between 30%, some cases 60%. So that's more than half. And that of course is going to affect unemployment. It's going to affect also, they are talking even about stagflation, so that means high inflation with also lack of GDP growth and high unemployment, and so on and so on. So we have discussed here that probability, and the markets are not taking it well. For instance, the S&P just on the past few weeks has lost around 1,000 points, actually more than that, around 50%. So basically is right now on a bear market, technically. Gold right now, gold is, apparently it reached a resistance on around $3,000 per ounce. The oil, the WTI, just straight up collapsed. Let's put here the chart, around $61. And the Brent just slightly higher, around $64 per barrel. So that is also indicating a probability of recession. Bitcoin has been chopping on the past, few weeks, few months after reaching an all-time high of around 100,000 per Bitcoin. And the most important thing, the DXY, basically the US dollar index, the dollar overall, is on 103. That has been chopping negatively on the past several weeks since Trump took office. However, is slightly rising since the announcement of the tariffs. And number 5, we have to talk about the Federal Reserve that Trump just this week announced after the tariffs, announced this is the perfect time, quote unquote, for interest rate cuts. That right now the Fed interest rate for reference is around 4.5%. So basically, that will mean that, of course, that's the way of Trump looking to get cheap money, cheap credit to the economy overall in order to prop up market prices and, reinvestment and things like that. Similar to what happened during the GFC, that back then, of course, we all remember what happened in 2008, the great financial crisis. And after the collapse of the markets and, of course, the mortgage markets, the Federal Reserve just got the interest rates to basically zero bound, and that created a significant bull market, very long and sustained bull market, of course, chop on the way. But basically, that's apparently a part of the recipe and the strategy of Donald Trump for this second administration. Big tariffs in order to look that the producers offshore come back and produce within the United States, or maybe also they apply the nearshore strategy, producing with close regional partners. Now, what's going to happen? We're going to have a recession. We're going to have a new world order regarding supply chains, offshoring, nearshoring. Well, each week we are going to cover this because this is honestly just the beginning. Thank you for watching Continental Insider. Please like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on social media. And if you want to work with us, continentalinsider.com. Thanks again, and have a nice day.